Hello, my name is Mahad Beg, president of the DRS as of 2022, and I'm with Rafi Usman, who's the current co-president, and the vice president, who is Rafael Abbasi. So today we're going to go into study designs. And I do ask for all of you to please bear with me. I'm also a student, so I'm not as familiar with each and every one of these study designs. There are also plenty more study designs and much more detail that we can go into. But this is just a rough overview just so that you all have some vague idea of what these study designs offer and how to make your decision in terms of which study design you want to go with. Because we have plenty of study design related lectures in our class, but what we often don't know is how to decide on one and where to start. So that's what we hope to answer today. And going right into it, we're going to look at deciding on a question, on a research question per the design. So what I mean by that is formulating what research question you want, with it in mind, what research designs we have available to us. So I'm going to describe it in terms of two pathways, pathway A and pathway B. So in both pathways, the first step that you make is to choose a topic. So for example, a topic would be something general, like maybe heart valve replacement. So maybe you want to study something related to heart valve replacement surgery. And in that case, you would then start thinking about what do you want to find out about heart valve replacement surgery? Maybe you want to find out whatever you want to find out by asking patients directly, specific questions that you have in mind, right? So that would be something kind of like a cross-sectional study, right? You would create some kind of questionnaire and you would approach heart valve replacement patients and compile their answers. So now that you've chosen a study design, specifically a cross-sectional study, for example, you would then go and find a professor who agrees and has access to the required resources. And in this case, the required resources are the patients who have had heart valve replacement surgery, for example. So then we want to look at pathway B, which is an alternative pathway, which I've written here because sometimes in pathway A, you will complete step 1 and step 2, but it'll be very hard for you to find a professor who will agree to work with you or a professor who has access to those resources that you need. In that case, pathway B might be preferable because you first choose a topic and then you find a professor within that field. So for example, you would think about heart valve replacement surgery, then you would find a professor who's involved with heart valve replacement surgery. And then you'd ask that professor, what kind of patients do you have at your disposal? Are we allowed to ask your patients these questions? Or do you at least have patient files that we can use of pre-collected data? And then if they say, no, you cannot ask my patients questions, but you can look at this patient data file, then you would rather go with something like maybe a observational study, right? Retrospective observational study. And so that would be the resulting research design according to your testable question. This terminology is probably sounding very confusing to a lot of you, but we're going to go into the specifics of this in the subsequent slides. And just to make sure everybody is on the same page, what I mean by testable question is any question that you want to investigate, a question that you want to have answered with the help of the data that you collect in your research. More factors to consider when you're deciding on the kind of research design you want to pursue is the time it takes to publish and the weight of that research. Of course, putting something on our CV should not be ever the main objective of our publishing. It should never be the main goal. Ultimately, we should be trying to contribute to the scientific field. But of course, it does matter for us, especially as students, to have it in mind that we need our CV to be pretty strong in order to have a chance at competing with domestic students in case you want to go internationally. And so I have arranged here roughly according to my best idea as a student. Again, once again, I'm only a student. I don't really have qualifications. So please take everything I say here in any lecture I do with a grain of salt. I'm just trying my best to help everybody I can. This is my idea of the least weight and the quickest publishing as compared to the most weight, but the longest time, which is how it naturally happens. And let's see what I mean here, is that the letter to the editor is a kind of publication. It's not even considered research by some people just because of how simple it is, but it's still a publication and it can still help with your CV, but it's the least weight. Next to that is the case report, which again is pretty quick. You can get it done in, I think my quickest case report that I've made has taken like a month from start to finish. And what I mean by finish is actually getting published. And then we have case series, which takes a little bit longer, observational study, which once again takes a little bit longer, cross-sectional study, which takes a lot longer, and then meta-analysis, which can take pretty long as well. Of course, this is not hard and fast. This is just a very rough kind of sequencing. The letter to the editor has the least weight on your CV versus something like a meta-analysis can be pretty impactful and can be considered pretty important. So let's get into, again, the general overview of the most friendly beginner research designs that we have. I've discussed letter to the editor, case report. I've already sort of gone over how hard or how difficult they are, but in general, a letter to the editor is going to be a short piece, a short publication that is addressed to the editor of a journal in order to address maybe new research or some kind of important point regarding the content of their journal. A case report is going to be a detailed study of a specific disease manifestation that is interesting for whatever reason, or a treatment that is interesting or novel. A case series is similar to a case report, except it involves multiple cases. Cross-sectional surveys involving questionnaires. Observational studies are usually retrospective in our context. And what I mean by that, by retrospective, means like back in time. That's what retrospective means. And so basically it's using pre-collected data from the past and compiling it in order to observe trends, and meta-analysis, which is a very important and heavy kind of research that I wish we had a little bit more experience in, because it basically is a study of studies. You compile all the other studies that have been done regarding your specific question or topic, and you compare the findings in order to see how strong the conclusion is, to see whether that question can be definitively answered. Now, one thing to keep in mind as you're beginning to write your research is that you may want to also peek ahead and see what publishers you're aiming for. And the reason why you would want to do that is so that when you're writing, you have their requirements in mind, because all publishers have different requirements regarding what kind of citations that they want, what they want it to be structured like, what headings to use. So if you know what publisher you want to try to go to first, then you can format your manuscript accordingly. So first off, we have letter to the editor. It's the shortest kind of publication that you can make, and it's very simple. Once again, addressing this specific point or new research. And your first step would be to find an appropriate journal that accepts letter to the editors, because not all journals do. I think a lot of my colleagues have recommended JPMA, and then you would read the requirements for the letter to the editor, and you decide on what specific point you'd like to highlight regarding that journal to the editor, or regarding whatever new research. And then you'd write a short entry on per the publisher's requirements. Now let's look at one example of a letter to the editor. So here is one that was published by Farooq Azam Rathore, and this was from JPMA, right here, Journal of Pakistan Medical Association. And as you can see, it's relatively short. It's only 2 pages. And they don't have too many references, 11 references. This is a little bit on the longer side of a typical letter to the editor. But as you can see, she's addressing a specific kind of article that she read in this journal. And she's addressing it by bringing up her counterpoints to it and her viewpoints, her experience, and she's supporting it with facts. All these little numbers here, these superscripts, they're called superscripts, and they're called in-text citations. And we're going to go over how to actually write citations in more detail in subsequent lectures as well. And it's a publication. You can see he's compiled all of this data very nicely in easy to read tables, and very simple, quick publication. All right, next, let's look at a case report. So this is somewhat a specialty of mine. I believe I have 4 currently published case reports myself. They're also very easy to write in my experience, relatively easy, I should say. and you would be highlighting some kind of rare manifestation of a disease or a new effective treatment for that disease. Of course, the first step would be to identify one of those rare manifestations or cases. And to do so, you would kind of need to have some clinical experience, which is why most of the time the professor or the doctor involved in your study will be the one who's handing you the patient files and the information that you will use to compile this manuscript. And so you have to also then research whether the rare manifestation is actually rare, because we don't really know that for sure as students. And perhaps a lot of it has already been published. So in that case, we wouldn't want to go with that. That's why it's so important for basically all kinds of research designs for you to do a brief literature search. Maybe I shouldn't even say brief, but just do a full-on literature search by searching online what has already been published on the topic. Because you need to see if it's worthy of publishing, if it's rare enough. And then you want to ensure that consent has been acquired from the patient. And then, of course, you want to decide on a title, abstract, write an intro, the case details, discussion, conclusion. We're going to look at all that in the specific example. And I'll show you guys one of my case reports that I published. This is the first one that I've ever published. And as you can see, we have the abstract section, which is just kind of like a brief overview of what happened in this case. And we have the introduction, which is a general, like a summary of the background knowledge that somebody might need regarding this kind of disease that we found. And in this case, it was a neurocutaneous pathology involving neurofibromatosis. And so we went into the different types of neurofibromatosis and neurocutaneous pathologies and lesions. And then here we have the case presentation section. And in the case presentation section, you essentially kind of relay everything that you would think about for history in the biodata. And you would follow it in order of how you approach that patient. You asked their history first, then you did your evaluation in terms of the physical assessment of the patient. And case reports often include pictures. So here we have a picture of this, this neurocutaneous lesion here. And this particular journal required us to have arrows. So again, every journal has different requirements. And so here's the caption for that, and more examination findings here. So that's what the case presentation means. And like you can see, in some pictures, we've even added a few more pointers to help readers understand what's going on in terms of the operation that we used. And that's another thing that we highlighted in this case, is the kind of operation that was used in order to treat this and obtain a good cosmetic effect. So then we have the discussion section, in which we talk about the sort of important things that we wanted to highlight by reporting this case. And then of course the conclusions. So that's for case report. Let's look into case series. A case series is very similar to a case report, except you have multiple cases involved because you want to look at a specific concerning pattern or maybe a treatment possibility that you see making improvements across multiple cases. And so again, ensure consent, manuscript writing, and publish according to the publisher's specifications. Let's look at an example of a case series. So in this case, we have clinical findings of multisystemic inflammatory syndrome in children with contrast to Kawasaki disease. And here they have followed this kind of format according to this publisher, Curious, with the introduction, case presentation. But one big difference you'll see here is that it lists case one, and they don't go into too much details regarding the treatment exactly. They have the pictures still, and they have some of these findings here, and then they'll go into case two, and then there'll be case three and case four, depending on how many cases they're on. Usually in a case series, there aren't too many cases, but of course, the more cases that you have regarding the specific finding that you want to highlight, the better. And then they talk about the discussion by giving some context. You see at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, pediatric patients were less vulnerable to the virus. And then we started seeing a newly evolved inflammatory syndrome. So that's what they kind of wanted to highlight here. And they provided a lot of tables and good conclusion as well. So now moving along into our cross-sectional survey. For cross-sectional surveys, you want to develop a testable question, of course. What do you actually want answered? And then you want to do a literature search to see who else has questioned, like made that question and investigated it. And then you want to find, ideally, a pre-validated questionnaire that you can use or compile. You can use multiple pre-validated questionnaires and merge them into a new questionnaire in a sense. It's not really a new questionnaire, but it's just multiple already pre-validated published questionnaires into an order that is somewhat new, I guess. That's why we hesitate to use the word new questionnaire, because if you created your own questionnaire, then you have to go through a series of vetting to make sure that the questionnaire is effective. That's why many professors will ask you to use a pre-validated questionnaire. Then for most cross-sectional surveys, you will have to do IRB submission, which can also delay the process of publishing because it takes time for the IRB to look over your case. And the person who is monitoring and supervising your group, the professor involved, will have to travel to DMC in order to stand in front of the IRB panel and defend your project. And then you'll, of course, have to do manuscript writing, and many cross-sectional surveys may use statistical analysis like a chi-square test, which we can also go over in subsequent lectures. And besides chi-square test, a lot of people also just simply use percentages and frequencies. And all that means is just counting how many people said this and how many people said that according to their percentage, for example. Now let's look at an example of a cross-sectional survey. Here we have an example of a cross-sectional survey involving nephrolithiasis. And in this investigation, what they did, as you can see in the materials and method, is that they had a questionnaire which they asked to nephrolithiasis patients, which is kidney stone. And these are the kind of questions that they asked here in the highlighted section. And they used this data to compile into the results section, which is given by this table, and to be able to draw conclusions, like what are the most important risk factors for nephrolithiasis. And that's the kind of question that they were able to address here. And so it's pretty simple. As you can see, it really helps to pick up a research design article that's similar to yours, or an article that's similar to what article you envision writing, because you can kind of follow the format of it. And of course, like I said, every journal has different requirements. So that's also something that you need to consider. Now let's look into the next kind of study we have, which is observational study. And in an observational study, no new data is collected. You use pre-collected data to observe trends and correlations. And so this can often qualify for IRB exemption, which is good because it doesn't really take as much time to get an IRB exemption as compared to getting IRB approval. And you cannot start your research until you have an IRB approval or exemption in this case. And so writing the manuscript is pretty simple. Most of the time you're going to use percentages and frequencies, and sometimes you can use a chi-square test. Let's look at an example of an observational study. So in this case, we have a retrospective observational study to assess the efficacy, safety, tolerability of dietary fiber supplemental combination in overweight or obese patients. Again, what it means by retrospective is data that has been collected in the past. So as you can see here, what they basically did was they looked at the data that was collected from patients who were receiving these supplements and measured the kind of changes that occurred in their weight or their BMI specifically. And they were able to draw conclusions from it. Another thing that you might notice is that in some studies, the abstract is kind of split into these sections, whereas other studies, it's all kind of merged together, just like in our case report section. Because these studies are slightly larger, that's why the abstract is sometimes split into these headings. Once again, you will need to look at the journal specifications because every journal has different specifications, but I'm just talking in like a broad term. That's how it is. And you can see the materials and methods here. They have this additional heading for diet pattern, physical activity, data collection, because it best suits the way that they conducted the research. We have plenty of helpful graphs here as well. Now let's look at the next study design, which is a meta-analysis. Unfortunately, I don't have too much experience with meta-analysis, but I cannot overstate how important meta-analyses are for evidence-based research, because it is, like I said, a study of studies. Essentially, you're compiling all the studies that have occurred over a specific testable question that you want to investigate, and you will evaluate what is the strength of the conclusions made. For example, if you want to know how effective is aspirin in pain reduction, then you would pull up as many researches that you can find on that topic and you would compare the findings that they've made according to the structure of the research to evaluate how accurate their finding is or how trustworthy their findings are. And you would use a very rigorous set of inclusion criteria to know which designs or which researches are worth including, and exclusion criteria that you would have to justify why you're excluding it. The reason why these are so important is because the biggest enemy of a meta-analysis is bias. Because if you're not including specific kinds of research, then you are influencing the outcome, which is not what you want to do, because you want to have the most accurate portrayal of what is the fact or what is the truth. Sorry. And to do so, you would have to calculate something called an effect score. And these things require a lot of statistical knowledge, which we'll go into in subsequent lectures once we have somebody a little bit more qualified on board. And once again, you use the statistics to measure which way the outcome is. So does aspirin really help with pain management or does it not, right? Oh, and let's look at an example of a meta-analysis as well. So here is a meta-analysis on the effects of hydroxychloroquine on COVID-19. As you might know, during COVID-19, there were plenty of people who advocated for the use of hydroxychloroquine, and we didn't have enough research that was rigorous enough to conclusively decide whether hydroxychloroquine has a legitimate effect on COVID-19. And so these investigators put together this meta-analysis to explore that. And to do so, they had to compile as many researchers as they could by using various search engines like PubMed, Google Scholar, all of these search engines. And they had to use their statistical analyses in order to identify what their conclusion was. So, of course, all research will have an introduction so that the readers are aware of the context. And then here's their materials and methods. The methods of a meta-analysis can be somewhat tricky, especially for our level, because it requires a lot of statistical knowledge. But they have outlined it in a very nice graph here. And as you can see, they've gone through several processes once they identify the kind of journals or the articles that they want to use. In PubMed, they found 14, in Google Scholar, they found 12, and so on. So that's the identification phase. Then they go and screen them because they needed to remove duplicates, eligibility, and then what they ultimately decided to include. And then we have different outcome measures involved in meta-analyses. And we have results, meta-analyses, and many different factors that you have to consider. A lot of different values and statistical knowledge is needed, like in these measurements. Heterogeneity is a term that is used to describe what is the variability of the outcomes of each study. And what I mean by that is that some studies might have found that hydroxychloroquine is effective in combating COVID-19, while other studies might have concluded that it is not. So if you have like a large degree of studies that are conflicting on their conclusions, then that means that there's a lot of heterogeneity. So that is as best as I could describe a meta-analysis, which admittedly is not a very good description and extremely brief and very rough, but hopefully we'll have somebody more qualified on board and we'll have additional videos going into more detailed sort of explorations of how to conduct each one of these research designs. So one thing that I also want to touch on is that there's some designs that we can access once we have more resources, like clinical trials. At our level, we don't always have professors that have HEC funding access to be able to do or participate in pharmaceutical drug trials, which happen much later. And it is where, of course, the drug is tested on human subjects. And the student can help by recruiting patients, interviewing patients, and helping in the writing of the manuscript. Animal models can be used often in the early stages of pharmaceutical development, and they basically involve using an animal and creating a model of some kind of disease, like for example, Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, and then testing certain compounds on those animals to see whether they're able to effectively address the issues that were modeled. And then we have gene sequencing, which also often requires lab materials, which we don't always have access to. But if we could have access to that, then it opens up a lot more doors for us to discover things like various correlations of certain genes with certain diseases. Or, for example, combating drug-resistant bacteria. Because if you don't have that background already, basically a lot of bacteria can develop resistances to certain drugs by various genetic processes, if I want to explain it simply. And so we can track those genetic markers in order to see how those bacteria are evolving to fight specific drug actions. So that is kind of our overview of the various research designs that we have available to us. And hopefully in the future, we'll have more qualified people on board with more experience who can go into more detail. But for now, that is our simple overview, and we will continue this series in subsequent lectures. Thank you.